the director of the Global Ocean Observing System Office, which is based here at the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission of UNESCO in Paris. I'll be moderating, and over the next hour, we'll start with an approximately 30-minute presentation from Oscar Schofield. Oscar is a professor and chair of the Department of Marine and Coastal Studies at Rutgers University in my home state of New Jersey in the USA. And he's also co-chair of the Southern Ocean Observing System, SOOS. SOOS is an initiative of the Scientific Committee for Antarctic Research and the Scientific Committee for Oceanic Research, so SCOR and SCOR, and has an international project office hosted by the University of Tasmania in Hobart. It's not formally a GOOS Regional Alliance, but has found some value, I think, and Oscar will tell us more about that, in cooperating with the GOOS Regional Alliances, and we're very happy to have their regional expertise contributing to our work. So after Oscar's presentation, we'll conduct a question and answer session by chat. I'll moderate and ask questions verbally. And the chat window is open already in the presentation. You can see it in the lower right-hand corner of your screen if you want to start asking questions already. And final note, the session is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be posted on the GOOS website. So Oscar, let me turn it over to you for your presentation.
Great. Thanks, Albert. And if anybody has trouble hearing, please just let me know. Thanks, first off, for letting us present to the GOOS community. We are, I guess, a baby goose and learning from the more advanced systems globally. So what I thought I'd do today is give you sort of an update, sort of a history of where SOOS has grown from, its motivations, and its strategy going forward. And, you know, unlike many other GOOS regions, what makes SOOS different, a different beast, in a sense, is that it represents an area with no international recognized boundaries, and it is essentially a compilation of the international community. The goals for GOOS actually came out scientifically almost a decade ago. Stephen Rentoul and Mike Sparrow, along with Mike Meredith and a host of characters you see here, developed a science plan and sort of justification and need for developing an integrated system to observe the Southern Ocean. And I'll touch on some of those, but what they identified in the science plan was, you know, some broad, very high priority science themes that pretty much affects the global system, whether we talk global circulation, sea level rise, or CO2 dynamics. Whoops. As that was finished, SOOS was maturing as a program office, and there was a nice investment by Australia that's also been supplemented with support from New Zealand as well as from Sweden. And there was a vision plan based on that science effort to sort of identify what are the key steps required, what are the technologies required, what are the activities that need to be coordinated. And really that second bullet, I would say, is one of the key things SOOS is focused on. What do we need in the next few years versus the next decade? And then what technology infrastructure requires funding? Again, SOOS itself isn't a funding agency. It's more a consortium organized around a program office. A lot of those efforts came up with sort of a consensus statement and really ultimately buoyed by the science plan as well as efforts by the IPCC and then the amazing SCAR Horizon Scan report, is what SOOS' ultimate goal is to detect and attribute changes in the Southern Ocean and what are the causes and impacts of those changes. And to that end, to identify that over such a large region, we need sustained and, very importantly, to emphasize internationally coordinated observations. It's beyond the capability of any one single country to address. SOOS was initiated with an international program office, again through support from the Australian government, and it's really focused on facilitating the collection and delivery of essential observations. First few years were focused on identifying what are the essential observations for the Southern Ocean across all stakeholders. Again, SOOS has no sort of governmental mandate, and so we work with the community to advocate sort of the most cost-effective observing technology, collaboration, standardization, and as well as acting as an advocate for those Southern Ocean efforts. So taking a step back, for those of you who don't work in the Southern Ocean, why would we need a SOOS? Well, the Southern Ocean is central to the Earth's metabolism. It's a region of deep ocean water mass formation. It's associated with large degree of upwelling from deep basins. And there are good indications that you could argue that 50% of the global anthropogenic carbon is taken up by the Southern Ocean. And so if you don't have a good understanding of the Southern Ocean, you're going to have a very difficult time balancing the carbon budget for the planet. You know, beyond its sort of central role in the Earth system, there's many observations that the Southern Ocean is showing change. So the left-hand panel sort of shows the retreat of ice sheets. Some regions we're seeing ice sheet advance, but in many regions, especially along the Amundsen Sea and the West Antarctic Peninsula, we're seeing dramatic declines that'll translate directly into sea level change. We're also seeing changes in the ecosystem. The right-hand panel shows penguin populations at Palmer Station, it's the U.S. Antarctic base, and the open circles indicate the Adelie penguin, which is a true polar penguin species, and over the last 30 years has shown dramatic decline. Doesn't mean that there's been a complete sort of decimation of life. What we're seeing in this region of the planet is large increases in subpolar species. So we're seeing dramatic changes. And we want to know where those changes are taking us. You know, the expectation is we're going to see continuing collapsing ice shelves. We're seeing the invasive species moving in, the charismatic king crab along the western Antarctic Peninsula, as well as if you talk about the northern regions of the West Antarctic Peninsula, is just the example I'm familiar with, you're essentially seeing soil formation, plant, and life moving in. So this area that is critical to the Earth system, that is monitored by a distributed community, is showing large change that's going to feed back on the global system. So if we want to say who needs the SOOS, it's obviously the researchers trying to balance sort of the planet dynamics. There are significant fisheries. Krill fisheries is one example in the Antarctic, so resource managers, a good example is the Camelar program. Policymakers, the IPCC, local planners globally, simply because the Antarctic will be one of the large drivers of sea level rise globally in the coming decades to centuries. We're seeing an increasing footprint of tourism and operators and ship operators, and that's important because the dynamics of the Southern Ocean affects the safety of those operations. And again, you know, weather and climate forecasters are going to have a hard time doing a great global estimate without having a good picture of what's going on in the Southern Ocean, as well as educators. So is SOOS feasible? I show this map to sort of show, you know, ship report showing sort of the coverage. The first thing to notice is that, of course, the southern hemisphere is much chronically undersampled relative to the northern hemisphere. And if you look at the Antarctic, there are whole regions of the continent that aren't sampled at all. Some regions see high traffic. The West Antarctic Peninsula is one example. And so are we even able to do it given the current investments? The other thing to emphasize about the Southern Ocean, it is a robust ocean that is very harsh. This is a picture from the back deck of a ship. The operator on the back of the ship, for those safety people, I will emphasize that they're latched in, is being hit by a wave, about a 30-foot wave. And so the question is even if we have the will, we have the capacity, do we have the technology? And what is fortunate for those working in the Southern Ocean, there has been a large increase in the technologies available. Ships have become robust. global scale Argo programs, as well as bioArgo, animal tags, autonomous system, ice tethered systems, all now provide an opportunity for us to sample the ocean in a new way. You know, because the Southern Ocean represents an international area, you know, any efforts to sort of standardize are going to require coordination across national entities and countries. And we know that that cooperation is possible. One great example was the International Polar Year, where international communities formed large-scale expeditions and worked it out. And here I've just sort of listed a series of programs that essentially show international cooperation central to sampling the Southern Ocean. So we have new technologies, we do have a need, and we have demonstrated in the past the ability to cooperate and come up with good cohesive sampling. Sort of as an example how the technologies have evolved, what you see here is essentially autonomous SLOCOM glider, and you see one track where in the left-hand panel the upper diamond represents the U.S. Antarctic base. Down at the bottom of the panel is the UK Rothera base, and you can see that now we, with autonomous systems, can actually link land bases. So land bases, which used to have a footprint on the scale of a zodiac, a few nautical miles at best, now can create a sustained shelf-wide presence if we desire, combined with the ships and other operations. So we're really poised at sort of a technical revolution, and now it's sort of developing the cooperative and cultural efforts to do that. The SOOS vision, it's ambitious given the scale of the Southern Ocean. We believe it's visionary given its distributed sampling needs. It's difficult, but it's absolutely important that it is built into the global ocean observing system given its central role in the climate. So what you see here, the first thing that the community has been doing in the Southern Ocean is split sort of the Southern Ocean into various zones. You see the WAP, that stands for West Antarctic Peninsula, the Weddell, the Indian sector, the Ross Sea sector, and the Amundsen sector. And what you see now are sort of sustained measurement efforts that exist. The blue dots are Argo. You see moorings, you see shipping lines, as well as sort of fixed sampling lines in the black. But embedded within this coherent, I shouldn't say coherent, but embedded within this distributed observing network tend to be a lot of international expeditions. And so what I'm popping up now are planned as well as ongoing efforts around the continent by different countries, showing you sort of coverage in areas of big interest. And so what we find is if you combine all these measurements, you start having the potential of a backbone. And so the need is to essentially move to combine the existing sustained measurements with these expeditionary efforts in a coordinated way so that we can combine all the data so the sum is more than the whole of parts. And so I'm just giving you an example of something I'm familiar with of how you might do that. Two large programs happening along the Southern Ocean right now. One is called SOCOM. It is deploying essentially a bioArgo fleet circumpolarly around the Antarctic continent. It's an NSF-funded initiative. It's really focused on trying to understand the dynamics of the circumpolar currents and the implications for the biogeochemistry of the Southern Ocean. So we have a funded program there. Separate to that are a series of time series programs along the West Antarctic Peninsula. One run jointly between the Germans and the Argentinians, another one by the U.S., an LTR program, and another one by the UK down at Rothera, known as the RATS program. And what we're finding there, the dynamics in the ecosystem, which those time series are looking at, are strongly dependent on the amount of heat delivered by the circumpolar current. So the SOCOM program, which is now giving us a much more synoptic and synthetic view of the circumpolar current, provides an input to interpret the dynamics in the ecosystem studies which are happening along the coastal regimes. So this is sort of an example where SOOS sort of provides, hopefully, the glue of being that blue arrow linking those two. And being more glue than the traditional way we do it, which is if I'm in one program and I happen to know someone in the other program, I can coordinate informally. SOOS provides a mechanism, hopefully, to link those programs so the scientists can get the data they need regardless of what program they're in. The unique operating conditions in the Southern Ocean require us to divide the ocean up into sort of different segments, and you see that here. One really represents the open ocean condition with minimal ice. That's probably the best sampled condition. As you move into the marginal ice zone, you need to sample under ice. You need to sample above the ice to do essentially ice-ocean-atmosphere interactions. Or it represents under ice sheets. It's probably one of the largest unexplored regions that have the highest implications. And 2, the deep ocean. The reason that we sort of split it up this way is the portfolio of technologies that can be applied to study it are pretty dramatically different and represent sort of different logistical constructs. And so what we want to do is to get coordinated those groups working those different regions to facilitate progress. So if we look at what SOOS's objectives are, we want to sort of facilitate the design and the implementation of a comprehensive observing system for the Southern Ocean. We want to guide and advocate the development of new observational technologies. Such a good example might be the under ice sheet observations, which really represent sort of a holy grail for technologists. We want to compile and encourage the use of existing standards and methodologies and facilitate standardization. If you look at the Southern Ocean as a whole, the international community maintains a large number of field stations making routine measurements. And there's been great efforts by the CONMAT community, but we want to make sure that measurements can be compared between all those field stations to come up with a sort of continent-wide view. We want to leverage further resources and essentially connect efforts by individual nations to other large-scale programs. We want to essentially develop that baseline long-term sustained observations and make it available for the community as an open resource to study, as well as advocate what future programs might come so that international communities and students and etc. might be able to take advantage of it. So how are we doing this? We're essentially forming grassroots working groups that focus on specific topics. We have regional working groups. These tend to be focused on a specific region, such as the West Antarctic, Peninsula, the Ross Sea, the Kerguelen Plateau. And we also have problem-specific working groups. These often tend to be focused around advancing the technology. And then you have essentially affiliated programs that might fill a gap in a specific region or might fill a problem-specific technology gap. So if we look at sort of priority working groups that are sort of moving forward, the implementation of under ice sampling is one of the groups. There's a sensor development group given the unique stresses of working in the Southern Ocean, an air-sea flux priority group, sort of a system design group, as well as a satellite capabilities group, ships of opportunity, and a sound working group. These working groups are managed by the Science Steering Committee of SOOS, which has it's an international group with rotation from the major research communities in the Southern Ocean. They review these working groups, both the regional and priority, and essentially make sure that they're actually working. The proposals are available online. They're reviewed by this committee, and they're open to all interested parties. And we know that we only have a subset of the available groups, so as new groups sort of identify real key needs, they might propose a priority working group. One of the first things that SOOS really focused on was essentially identifying what are the essential things that all groups need to measure. That was built on the framework of ocean observations, the FOO, which is the foundation of GOOS. We want to essentially work with GOOS and be parallel administering it We've got physical and chemical variables, identified biological variables across GOOS as a whole is a big topic. There was a large international workshop hosted a few years ago, sort of developing the Southern Ocean key biological variables, and that was just published in the Journal of Marine Systems. Example of why we might choose a specific region. It's often focused on a region where there's a significant number of existing observations, has existing infrastructure, and has the potential for many nations to be involved. One of the first ones that's being spun up, and there'll be an international meeting in the United Kingdom next spring, is the West Antarctic Peninsula. You see in the left-hand panel a map of the West Antarctic Peninsula, and the red identifies all the international field stations. The majority of those field stations are making routine measurements, and again, we don't have a comprehensive up-to-date list of the standardization of what measurements are going to be made, what programs we run out of each of those, and how those programs might be leveraged off each other. And so the working group is sort of going to focus on developing a community of practice and a scientific community communication mode to essentially get those standardized. You know, the management community has what's called a CONMAP group, and essentially that allows the different agencies to essentially work on unifying and improving logistics as well as science planning. You know, the working group for the West Antarctic is sort of viewed as a partner to that, but more from the science side to ensure that we make the measurements we need to make in this specific area. You know, an example of another function that SOOS does, as communities put proposals into their national agencies, they can get an endorsement from the SOOS community. It comes with some stipulations in the sense that it provides open access, open communication. And so a good one is the UK-led effort to develop sort of ice shelf thickness measuring systems. You know, and SOOS is working with that group to coordinate sort of the acceleration and uptake of this technology by nations working on or near the ice shelves, you know, and develop a more coherent footprint covering the major ice shelves. And it works with large communities that have international workshops to make sure we focus on key priority areas, we develop standards of practice, as well as develop an open dialogue between those communities. So what's progress so far? For task teams, we've already had a workshop on the air-sea fluxes that was held in Italy. We've developed satellite data requirements community report. It's currently out for review. There's been a Ross Sea observational census that's been done, and that's been spread out. Mike Williams and collaborators were leaders on that, as well as sort of developing the international strategy for making under ice observations. The other thing SOOS is trying to do is to develop a portal. You know, what is difficult about working in this area is it's an international community, it's very distributed, and communication between science groups is sometimes hard. So SOOS has developed a comprehensive website. It will point you to the different working groups, whether it's the capability ones or the regional working groups. We also develop what's task teams. That's usually a very short-lived group, which might be focused on if a national entity is requiring a national report on a specific capability, we might pull people together to essentially do that. And so we welcome everyone to come check out the website and use it and also contribute to it. Finally is getting access to the data. Unfortunately, much of the data is out of reach. It is, again, managed by many different groups. And SOOS is not going to be essentially able to construct a centralized data system that will essentially be an integrated database. But what we're developing is sort of the library and catalog and then the links to specific databases globally. And so we're growing this over time. And we sort of split the data sets into essentially the type of data that's available, whether you're talking paleoclimate, biosphere, solid earth, oceans, etc. And so, this is being linked to existing national and international databases. We're not trying to recreate the wheel. We're trying to just create a single window where researchers can come in, find what they need, and do what they need to do. So it's really a data discovery and delivery tool. And sort of an example of some of the new products are, what are the maps of Southern Ocean mooring locations globally? And so here is a snapshot. It shows essentially where moorings have been deployed. The red are the ones currently deployed. Yellow is retrieved, so maybe you want to go back and get some historical data. Gray is where we're not sure about the deployment status. White is failed. Luckily, we don't see very many on this map. And turquoise represents planned. However, the one thing we would really like to do is to grow the number of turquoise dots to make sure the entire community can see it. Because our hope is if we have a better picture of what shared resources exist, that's going to facilitate global benefit by communication in terms of either leveraged opportunities or ancillary other measurements. So we welcome all people to provide comment. The website is listed here. Many of the people who have contributed funding and growth to it are listed below, and really it represents an effort that's really been championed by the SCOR communities, and so we're indebted very much to them. So that's what I have here.
Thank you very much, Oscar. A really great presentation, and I encourage anyone who is in the audience, and there's quite a few of you, to ask questions in the chat window. I'll get started with some questions for Oscar. Let me start with, you've talked about the two major motivations for SOOS being climate and the key role of the Southern Ocean system in climate, but then also the impacts of climate on the Southern Ocean resources, and then the resources aspects. One thing, often around this time of year, we look at the Arctic and yes, there's news stories about the sea ice extent. That's not so true of the Antarctic. Can you tell us why?
Yeah, well, there is a sea ice map that is constructed every year. Because it tends to be far away from a lot of countries that affect them year to year, it doesn't have as much play. It also represents sort of an area where it leads to a lot of confused discourse about climate. So if you go to the Ross Sea, what we do see is that the Ross Sea has generally been growing. The West Antarctic area has been melting pretty dramatically. To give you an idea of sort of the change in the West Antarctic, the sea ice season there is about 90 days shorter than it was 30 years ago. So we see large changes. So I think more it's a proximity issue directly related to what you have on your door. However, if you look at projected ice declines in the future, you're talking about raising sea level by many, many feet. And so it will represent a source that could be as large as the Greenland ice sheet retreat.
And certainly overall, Antarctica has quite a bit more land ice, of course, like to contribute to sea level rise. On the resource management side, what are some main...
over the long term,
Go ahead, sorry to interrupt.
Krill and fish, are the main things that are a focus of sort of resource extraction. The Camelar group is an international community sort of charged with managing that, and a lot of federal groups, at least like example would be like NOAA in the U.S. has maintained a time series sort of up on that fisheries. There's a long history of sort of fishing extraction from the Southern Ocean. Whaling 100 years ago almost wiped out those populations, and they've come back dramatically back forth right now. And so it really, the CAMLR sort of approach sort of provides a sort of focused advisory role to help with those management efforts and to sort of establish what are sustainable quotas for those southern oceans. But we don't have much of a baseline and very limited data, really.
So we have two questions from South America, from Martin Saraceno, and who's from Argentina, if I remember correctly, and Walter Pinaya from Brazil. How far north does the SOOS extend, and what do you see opportunities for further collaboration with other groups?
Yeah, so for essentially the northern extent of it, we kept that purposely sort of very blurry, in part because, the system is really dominated by sort of the dynamics and forcing of the circumpolar current, which shows large undulations that might go as, high as 50 south. And so we haven't really established a northern boundary for that. So we see numerous opportunities, and some of the really interesting questions are going to be at that north-south boundary of the polar front. And so we'd rather be inclusive of the system itself rather than establish a fixed boundary. And so I think that this is sort of an ongoing discussion group that, we will be focusing on in the coming years, and might be a focus of one of these sort of working groups or task teams. And I think that sort of addresses both of those things. It's like what we'd rather do, because we're grassroots, we're distributed, we'd like to have the community essentially help define those for us.
Oscar, you mentioned SOOS as being...
for the sound monitoring group...
Go ahead. Sorry, the delay makes it sometimes a little difficult to have a conversation. So go ahead and answer.
No.
About sound.
The sound working group, I'm not actually in it. I believe it is looking at what is the soundscape of the Southern Ocean and to what degree we see both anthropogenic and natural noise. I think it's essentially also trying to look at to what degree sound might provide sort of a means to have a sustained monitoring capability that might be tractable, cost-effective, and sort of scalable relative to sort of traditional ship sampling. And, if you think of it from sort of a whaling perspective, right now our whale censuses really are dominated by essentially ship sampling, and the soundscape might provide a good mode to get a better idea on that.
So Oscar, you mentioned that SOOS was very much a science-driven observing system in terms of the motivation for it and in terms of the engagement. Has there been any attempt to connect to the Antarctic Treaty or to CAMLR, some of these local resource management governmental systems that might provide mandates for sustained observations?
Yes, so a good example is CAMLR. Andrew Constable is one of the steering committee XCOM members for SOOS. He's central to the CAMLR program. And if you look at the regions that we've essentially established around the Southern Ocean, and a lot of them are based on sort of those CAMLR monitoring ones, we've been working or essentially connecting to the CONMAP group. Southern Ocean, just given its sort of faraway location, tends to be really dominated by or limited by the logistics. And the CONMAP group is all the national agencies that work down there. They work together to operate things effectively and safely. And so we're constantly getting feedback from them and trying to incorporate that into the science planning. And, while we are science focused, we are cognizant that a lot of the mandates and the baselines we need are going to come from these other groups, and we want to work with them on that.
On that line, I should mention that the requirements that SOOS has for observation of climate-related parameters certainly feed into the GCOS implementation plan, which is going to be presented to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change this November next month. So certainly there is requirements for Southern Ocean observations that feed through the climate requirements. Let me touch on another area of work that you've been that was just published, as you mentioned, which is the ecosystem essential ocean variables, which is the work of one of the SOOS working groups. There are I can't remember exactly how many, but I think of the order of 40 variables that were identified. How do you think the word essential was used in that case, and how feasible is it to measure all of those variables?
Yeah, I mean, what that report did is it sort of prioritized sort of a framework to go forward. So while there was a large number, 40, of total variables that the community identified, there were sort of an effort to which are priority variables, and that was driven by what we can actually measure, and especially in this location, where a good example might be in temperate and tropical systems. Benthic sampling might, be very tractable. In the Southern Ocean, it's very difficult given the harsh operating and dangerous conditions to collect that data. So, while there was a large number of essential based on the science needs, which is what we use to drive it, the priority list was really also focused on identifying what are the ones we can measure now in a way that can be distributed across a broader group. So the number that we see implemented is those EOVs is actually smaller, based simply on what can we measure and how can we do it.
So we have a question from Joni Johannesson about.
I saw a question there by Johnny.
Yeah, so it's about interaction with the modeling community for the Southern Ocean. Can you learn from them in setting the requirements?
Yes, I mean there is interest in sort of doing sort of these observation simulation experiments. Here we're actually leveraging off existing efforts by some large-scale programs. A good example is the SOCOM program. The SOCOM program, I emphasize the bio-argo part because I'm an observationalist, but Matt Masloff and Joe Ellen Russell lead a very large global modeling group that's developing essentially the SOSI, the sort of a simulation schemes for the Southern Ocean. And it's pretty critical because if you look at sort of some of the global models, they have a hard time getting the bottom temperatures right for a lot of the Southern Ocean and have a hard time really getting a realistic picture of the dynamics of the circumpolar current, which is critical to what the forcing is. And so right now, because we're not a funding agency, essentially we try to link ourselves to those large-scale programs doing that. And so to that effect, on our latest rotation of the Science Steering Committee, Matt Masloff from the SOCOM program was pulled in, and so he provides sort of the conduit of knowledge across the international community that might be conducting sort of global scale simulations. Right now, as that modeling work is going forward, we haven't formally initiated, but we've talked a lot about sort of SOOS design and implementation, sort of simulation experiments, and we view that as sort of work to be done because we haven't gotten that started yet.
Keeping on the theme of requirements, you mentioned that the satellite requirements report that was published. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and to which audience it was aimed?
It was aimed as, I'm going to split that into two parts. One part, there was a request because, way too often the satellites are taken for granted, especially by the research community, that it's always going to be there. And so there was a specific request of sort of how is satellite data being used and what is its impact. And so part of it was to quickly try to get a response to that so that we didn't send the impression that the satellite observations weren't the central backbone to what the observing network was. But there's also, if you think of it in terms of sea ice dynamics, as well as ice sheet dynamics and potentially other derived products, there are some unique satellite needs for the Southern Ocean, the Southern continent, and what we were wanting to do was just sort of compile all that into a census.
Okay, and how has it been received by the satellite community?
It was positively received because they were essentially asking for the inputs, and so I'm not actually familiar with sort of the process they're taking the report, but what I do know is they were very happy with having a single location to go request the information and then have the community to essentially compile it in a comprehensive way across disciplines. So, I think it was an example of an external community to us, of which some of us might be involved in, that then were able to essentially provide in a timely way sort of a comprehensive list of information that helped them for their own sort of efforts in terms of advocating for new systems and new platforms.
That's a really nice example of linking between
and that's
systems.
Yeah, because I mean, I think if you look at the Southern Ocean community, it's very dynamic. We all know each other, but we are all funded, and culturally it's quite distributed. And so until we had International Polar Year and some of those types of programs, what should be a natural area of collaboration was more difficult than it should have been. And so SOOS is hoping to do it, and that's one example of how it works.
You've talked about the harsh environments and therefore the close link, in fact, to the research community and sustained observations, because research is needed to improve the feasibility. You mentioned these different process studies that SOOS is trying to help coordinate. So two questions. You mentioned the IPY. How important was the IPY in helping to launch SOOS? And then second, what's the main coordination body for these different research projects around Antarctica? Is it SCOR?
SCOR is the biggest sort of global entity, and what's nice about SCOR is it has an Antarctic-wide perspective. While we tend to be very focused on the ocean side of things, SCOR will include the terrestrial ecosystems, ice sheet dynamics, and in this system, if we use sort of the ice sheets that are retreating as an example, it's the flux of heat from the deep ocean underneath the ice sheets that is the engine for the melt. And so it really becomes a couple problem. So SCOR is an international intellectual hub, would be a leader on that. And so what we want to make sure we do is if you go to the SCOR, sort of organization, they'll have a series of working groups that might be focused on biodiversity, biogeochemistry, carbon dynamics, global modeling. And what we try to do is not sort of reproduce what they're already doing. What we hope to do is use the outputs from those working groups to facilitate working groups to then focus on a specific output. So we have a new tool, so, all right, SCAR might have a biodiversity, Antarctic working group that's really focused on, let's say, the Peninsula system, and then the SOOS working group shouldn't be focused on reproducing what they already do. It should focus on what is the census of measurements being made along the West Antarctic Peninsula, and are they making the same measurements? So you can compare a chlorophyll sample from the north and south and have confidence that you're getting the same answer. And so we really view it as a working group. I'm sorry, I forgot the first part of your question. Yeah.
It was about the IPY and its role in helping to launch SOOS.
Oh, yeah, the IPY was an incredibly important mechanism. It established and demonstrated, I think that was the key thing, sort of the key role of international cooperation. The ones I'm familiar with or I was involved with was sort of Swedish, US, and UK coordinated efforts to sample the Amundsen Sea and Pine Island Glacier, which is showing such rapid retreat. And it was critical in the sense that it essentially got the core initial group together and provided sort of a good output of success that helped sort of push Australia and some of these international groups to spin up a program office. Before, we were a loose consortium of champions, and that program office, I would say, in one part grew out of the IPY success. So now we have a body that helps manage this distributed community in a coordinated way.
So continuing on with the theme about the harsh environments and the technology, you've talked about the development of technology for observations, new autonomous technology like gliders. For you, what are some of the most exciting technologies on the horizon?
Yeah, so I think Argo does a really great job in BioArgo of sampling the open ocean component. It samples under the ice, and so I think we get a nice observational footprint that way. The gliders now are sort of becoming more of a routine deployment mechanism. The next things we need to do is develop the capacity to fly these autonomous systems under ice. It's been done for short sort of expeditionary missions, AutoSub, for example, under some of the ice sheets. And really that represents sort of one of the observing gaps, so novel navigation systems for these autonomous systems, because once we cross that barrier, we can fill in a sustained snapshot across the continental shelves and the boundary where then the Argo system takes up. So I think that shows great promise. The other thing that is maturing quickly is the untended aircraft system, the UAVs. They obviously have a large sort of regulatory side to them, but they represent a means now to map large regional areas, and it's been demonstrated. And so, again, because this area can be extremely harsh and not very safe, allowing humans to have a regional presence but being safe either from field stations or even back home, to me is really exciting, and it provides data on a large enough spatial scale where it might enable the modeling community via assimilation to improve their own model outputs, because ultimately getting those models up where they're a predictive tool as well as a science tool will be a key thing that we need to do.
Just to follow up on that, the two technologies you mentioned are largely measuring physical and some biogeochemical variables. What about for biological variables?
Yeah, well, I mean, if you think of it, as we were sort of going down sort of from right now, you can do pH, you can do chlorophyll, you can do particle load. If you look at sort of the evolution of sensor packages, there are groups essentially working to get pocket-sized telegraphy. If you look at the soundscape, gliders have carried passive listening systems to listen for whale call in the Amundsen Sea along the West Antarctic Peninsula, and active acoustic systems to essentially measure krills. There's been a series of nice papers from scientists in the British Antarctic Survey to demonstrate that. So I think what we've been focused on in the last decade are the platforms and getting those hard. And now they're pretty hard. They're ready to be used. It's more now how we might actually improve navigation and integrate these new sensors in. And that's being funded by the global community because, that's happening inside and outside of the Southern Ocean system. And then it's just about implementation into the Southern Ocean programs.
So we have a question from Marcus Stalker about the data system, can you describe, is there a document that describes the architecture of the data management platforms for SOOS? And let me ask an additional question, is there a common data policy?
Yeah, well, there is a document, and if you write me, I'll point you to that. What we did is we brought together a lot of the international national agencies and drivers of international databases. And so our first step is to essentially provide links. And so you have the catalog, but then also the metadata, because that's the critical part in terms of identifying to what degree you want to merge it. And so that is available. We'd be happy to share it. And you can probably, if you go into the SOOS website, there's a dedicated sort of data manager. Kit Bircher is there, and so if you're interested in that, I would reach out to her directly. And the other thing is as this is evolving, a lot of the strategy in terms of actually what we were going to do sort of evolved at a meeting in Hobart just over a year ago. So we're also in the early stage to take lots of feedback, from people outside of the community to help us make sure it is useful and effective for the community as a whole.
Thanks, Oscar. And we have a question from Sam Simmons, who is the co-chair of the GOOS Biology Panel. You've described SOOS having a similar role to the GOOS Regional Alliances. Has the group discussed or considering formally joining as a GOOS Regional Alliance?
We've talked about it. I think that what we've felt is our first thing we got to do is get buy-in from all the Southern Ocean community. So if you take the West Antarctic, Peninsula as an example, before we can get the community to be mandated to make measurements in a certain way with a certain frequency, we got to get their buy-in because they're all funded by different groups. And so we've been sitting in on the GOOS meetings. Albert and Tim Moltmann have been very kind to let us, sit and listen so that we can track where we're going and make sure it's going in the similar direction that GOOS is going. And so I think in the future, SOOS might move forward to become, a regional partner. But before we sign up, we want to make sure that we could meet the GOOS commitments of actually signing up to do that. And so it's a work in progress. It's something we'd like to get to, but I think it is something we're not quite ready for yet.
Yeah, thanks, Oscar. A question about coming back actually a little bit to the technology, but then also about the connections with other observing systems. I know a lot of polar scientists actually switch between field seasons between the Arctic and the Antarctic. Are there some similarities between SOOS and an Arctic ocean observing system that can be exploited, given the fact that there isn't actually an organized Arctic ocean observing system at the moment?
Yeah, there is nascent groups essentially developing similar plans, for the Arctic system, and we're in active discussion with them. We've actually been tossing around the idea of maybe, one of our upcoming meetings where we bring the sciences, we try to coordinate our science steering committee with actual science meetings of a specific interest. And so one of them might be held in the future, with an Arctic meeting to do it. A lot of the technologies, face the similar challenges in the Arctic and the Antarctic. And so, if you look, a good example would be, for gliders, the Arctic's groups are really the great innovators of under ice navigation and pushing the envelope. And myself, being inherently lazy, am happy to essentially learn from them and apply those lessons down for the Southern Ocean. And so there is actually a lot of crosstalk going on between them. And implementation. The one, thing that is, slightly different is if you look at ice sheets, which really represent a high priority, science theme for SOOS, is it represents a whole different engineering strategy we'll need to do. But the marginal ice zone stuff and the Arctic ice cap have a lot of similarities, and we're already benefiting from the great work that's happening up there, and we hope that we can be a benefit to them.
So let's come back to the under ice zone, particularly in the shelf under the permanent ice cap. You had a workshop about 2 years ago. Can you tell us a little bit about the outcomes of that and what you think what technologies particularly you think are really ready for sustained observations?
I think that there is some development in terms of sort of trying to deploy fixed platforms under there. Um, the gliders, as proven by the Arctic group, are slowly moving in that direction. And so when we talk about sustained measurements here, you know, if we can get months of data, that is a unbelievable new system for us. There are essentially, systems where you drill through the ice sheet and then you deploy hanging strings of instruments and everything like that. The Norwegians and community are drivers in that, and so I think that that represents another approach. The difficulty for a lot of the ice sheet areas, you're in areas where there might have only been a handful of cruises ever conducted, and so, the problem here is sustained means that you need to develop a system that can be deployed and then maintained for years because you have no guarantee of when the next ship is going to be in for recovery. And so then that moves into the real-time comms. So I think we're going to be looking at, in the near term, sort of a portfolio that would include sort of radar systems to get ideas of thickness as much as possible, fixed string things through the ice, as well as then mobile systems trying to get probably right now more snapshots in terms of the dynamics of the circumpolar current flowing in underneath the ice. That's likely going to be where we are in the near term before we can really do multi-year sustained missions.
And from a scientific perspective, is there a particular season that's more important than others, or is it really a year-round monitoring effort that's needed?
I think ultimately we're going to need a year round, but like one thing we know, if you look at the West Antarctic Peninsula, the summers air temperature, water temperatures haven't increased much in temperature. It's the winters that have shown the largest change. Um, and I think that, one gap we have is what's happening in winter, and then, the annual snapshot, do we see squirts of hot water flowing in under the ice sheet? Really is a high frequency event that is very seasonally driven? Is there a huge seasonal flush? And right now we're sort of reliant on models and those kinds of approaches to assess that. And we can provide the modelers sort of the ground truth or initialization data that they might need to drive those to have high predictive skill. It's a great science question because it's really wide open and it has huge impact.
Okay. And then one last question. I think the size of the Antarctic Ocean observing community is fairly small. So does that help build a common system? On the other hand, are there efforts also to increase the size of that community to increase its capability?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the way we're going to grow it, I mean, you're still, for any national scientist, you're still going to go to your national agency. And then the footprint of being down in the Antarctic is always limited by berths, whether you're at a field station or on the ship. That's where I think some of these autonomous technologies with global transmission become really important, because all of a sudden now we might facilitate a whole community of researchers who can conduct really cutting edge research without having to actually have a physical presence in the continent, because that is the most expensive and hardest things to do. And so I think getting real-time data transmission from as many of the different diverse data systems is really the key that we need to get to, because we need more people to be playing in this area. And yet we have a fixed number of berths because we have a fixed number of ships with a fixed number of ship days that are always going to be limiting.
All right, thank you very much, Oscar. It's really been a fascinating presentation. It's fascinating work. I think the project office has also really worked hard to help organize your community, so I want to congratulate them. And thank you again for your presentation. Yoni, yes, the presentation will be available on the GOOS website along with a recording of the webinar, and we will announce our next webinar schedule very soon. Thank you very much again, Oscar, and thanks to the audience.
Great, thank you.